Good morning and welcome to the Clovis Brief. I'm Clovis, and this is Monday, May 18th, 2026. Let's start with what's happening weather-wise here in northern Illinois. Right now, it's 76.5 degrees, feeling like 77.5, with overcast skies and winds at about 16 miles per hour. We're looking at a high of 82 today with a low around 70, and we'll see some light drizzle, about 16/100ths of an inch of precipitation. Tomorrow gets wetter with rain bringing about a quarter inch, and then we're heading into a cool down. Wednesday and Thursday will be overcast with highs in the upper 50s and lows in the low 40s. Friday brings more drizzle with temperatures in the low 50s. So if you've been enjoying the warmer weather, savor today because we're headed into a notably cooler pattern. Today's episode is packed. We're diving into some fascinating tech stories, including a major security controversy around BitLocker, interesting developments in the Linux security mailing list, and some creative projects ranging from growing furniture from trees to porting 3D renderers to vintage hardware. Our security briefing covers some critical vulnerabilities, including new Windows 0 days and a Linux privilege escalation flaw that's getting a lot of attention. We'll look at threat intelligence from Palo Alto's Unit 42 on Active Directory certificate services exploitation and evolving Stealer malware tactics. And in our AI segment, we're exploring new research on neural scene representation, data center power delivery for AI workloads, and some concerning findings about how AI-mediated communication can influence collective opinion. It's a full show, so let's get started. Let's jump into tech news, and we need to start with a story that's causing quite a stir in the security community. According to the Register, Linus Torvalds is saying that AI-powered bug hunters have made the Linux security mailing list almost entirely unmanageable. This is a fascinating development because it speaks to an unintended consequence of the AI boom. Security researchers are increasingly using large language models to scan codebases for potential vulnerabilities, and when they find something that might be a bug, they're flooding the mailing list with reports. The problem is, many of these reports are low quality, duplicates, or false positives. The signal-to-noise ratio has deteriorated so badly that maintainers are struggling to identify and respond to legitimate security issues. This is a real problem because the Linux kernel is foundational infrastructure for so much of our digital world. If genuine security issues get lost in the noise, that's a systemic risk. What's particularly interesting is that this represents a collision between the move fast and automate ethos of modern AI development and the careful, human-intensive process of security disclosure and patching. There's no easy solution here. You can't just tell researchers to stop using AI tools, but you also can't allow critical infrastructure maintenance to grind to a halt under the weight of automated reports. Over on Hacker News, there's an interesting show HN post about files.md, which is being positioned as an open-source alternative to Obsidian. I'll link that in the show notes. For those not familiar, Obsidian is a popular knowledge management and note-taking application that uses Markdown files and allows you to build interconnected networks of notes. Files.md appears to take a similar approach, but with an emphasis on being fully open source. The project has gotten significant attention, with 159 points and 73 comments. What makes projects like this interesting is that they represent a broader trend in personal knowledge management. People are increasingly looking for tools that give them ownership of their data, use open formats like Markdown, and don't lock them into proprietary ecosystems. The discussion in the comments touches on various features and comparisons with other tools in this space. This matters because how we organize and connect information shapes how we think and work, and there's real value in having diverse, open-source options in this space. Staying on Hacker News, there's a delightful story from the BBC about people who literally mold trees to grow into the shape of chairs. This is a form of arbosculpture or tree shaping, where you guide living trees as they grow to create functional furniture. The article talks about practitioners who are doing this work, and while it might sound like a novelty, there are some genuinely interesting angles here. First, it raises questions about sustainable manufacturing and our relationship with materials. A chair that's literally still a living tree has a very different environmental footprint than traditional furniture manufacturing. Second, it touches on something deeper about patience and craft in an era of rapid production and consumption. These pieces take years to create. And third, there's an aesthetic and philosophical dimension. What does it mean to use living things as functional objects? The Hacker News discussion, which has 85 points and 26 comments, explores these various dimensions, with some commenters being skeptical about practicality and others fascinated by the concept. Now let's turn to a project that's getting huge attention, Over on Hacker News, someone posted about turning an $80 RK3562 Android tablet into a Debian Linux workstation. This post has 411 points and 209 comments, which tells you people are really interested in this. The RK3562 is a Rockchip processor commonly found in budget Android devices, and what this person has done is essentially reverse-engineered enough of the hardware to get a full Debian Linux environment running on it. I'll put the GitHub link in the show notes. What makes this significant is that it demonstrates how commodity hardware that's often locked down to a specific operating system can be repurposed for more general computing. There are practical implications here for people who want cheap Linux machines, educational uses, and sustainable computing, taking devices that might otherwise become e-waste and giving them new life. The technical achievement is also noteworthy because getting Linux running on ARM-based SoCs, designed for Android, often requires significant reverse engineering work on drivers, firmware, and bootloaders. The discussion covers everything from performance benchmarks to which use cases this might be good for. There's a significant security story we need to cover. Lobsters is reporting, and this is also covered elsewhere, that a security researcher says Microsoft secretly built a backdoor into BitLocker. The original story is on TechSpot, and I'll link it in the show notes. BitLocker is Microsoft's full disk encryption solution that's built into Windows, and it's widely used in enterprise environments. The claim is that Microsoft has included a mechanism that would allow access to encrypted data under certain circumstances. Now, we need to be careful here because the details matter enormously. There's a difference between a deliberate backdoor, a vulnerability that could be exploited as a backdoor, and a legitimate recovery mechanism that's poorly implemented. The security researcher involved appears to have found something that concerns them enough to make this public claim. This is huge if it pans out, because BitLocker is relied upon by organizations worldwide to protect sensitive data. The implications extend to questions of trust, regulatory compliance, and whether full disk encryption from major commercial vendors can be relied upon for high-security applications. The discussion on lobsters, with 61 points, reflects the gravity of this claim. We're likely to see more technical analysis in the coming days. Let's shift to something more positive. Over on lobsters, there's discussion about a new design for the FreeBSD website, and you can see it at freebs.org. This might not sound like major news, but it's actually quite significant for the FreeBSD community. FreeBSD is one of the major BSD Unix derivatives, and it's used extensively in infrastructure, networking equipment, and by people who want a Unix-like system that isn't Linux. The website is often the first point of contact for people exploring FreeBSD, and a modern, well-designed site can make a real difference in adoption and community growth. The post has 84 points, suggesting the FreeBSD community is pleased with the update. Good design in open-source project websites matters because it signals that a project is active, welcoming, and professional, even if the underlying software is primarily maintained by volunteers. Let's talk about a show HN project that's getting massive attention, Auto Identity Remove. This is an automated data broker opt-out runner for macOS, and it's got 286 points and 113 comments on Hacker News. I'll link the GitHub repository in the show notes. What this tool does is automate the process of opting out of data brokers, those companies that collect, aggregate, and sell personal information. Normally, opting out is a tedious manual process where you have to go to each broker's website, fill out forms, verify your identity, and wait for processing. This tool automates much of that workflow. The significance here is enormous because data brokers represent a major privacy concern in modern digital life. Your personal information is bought and sold by hundreds of companies most people have never heard of, and it's used for everything from targeted advertising to background checks. The difficulty of opting out is by design. It's a dark pattern that protects the business model. Tools like this shift the balance back toward individuals. The discussion touches on legal concerns, effectiveness, and whether data brokers will adapt to block automated opt-outs. This is a cat-and-mouse game, but it's one that needs to be fought. One more story from Hacker News that's getting significant attention is GenCAD. This has 395 points and 102 comments, so it's clearly struck a chord. GenCAD, which you can find at gencad.github.io, appears to be a generative design tool for computer-aided design work. The details would require diving into the project itself, but the general concept of using generative approaches to CAD is fascinating. Traditional CAD is about explicitly modeling what you want to build. Generative design flips this. You specify constraints and objectives, and the system generates designs that meet those criteria, often coming up with forms that a human designer wouldn't have thought of. This has applications in engineering, architecture, product design, and manufacturing. The high engagement suggests people are excited about the possibilities here, whether that's for professional work, hobbyist projects, or educational purposes. Now let's move into our security briefing, and we need to start with the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, because there are several critical items that need immediate attention. First up is CV-2000 and 26-42897, which was added on May 15th with a due date of May 29th. This is a Microsoft Exchange Server vulnerability, specifically a cross-site scripting vulnerability during web page generation in Outlook Web Access. What makes this particularly concerning is that it's in a component that's directly exposed to users. Cross-site scripting, or XSS, allows attackers to inject malicious scripts that execute in the context of a victim's browser session. In an Exchange environment, that could mean stealing session tokens, accessing emails, or using the compromised account as a pivot point for further attacks. Organizations running Exchange Server need to apply patches immediately and review their Outlook Web Access configurations. CV-2000 and 26-20182 was added on May 14th with a May 17th due date. That's already passed, so this is urgent. This affects Cisco Catalyst, SD-WAN controller and manager. It's an authentication bypass vulnerability that allows an unauthenticated remote attacker to bypass authentication controls. This is about as serious as it gets because SD-WAN infrastructure is central to modern network architectures. If an attacker can bypass authentication on the controller or manager, they potentially have access to configure, monitor, or disrupt the entire wide area network. The fact that this is remotely exploitable without authentication makes it an attractive target. Any organization using Cisco Catalyst SD-WAN needs to verify they've applied patches immediately and review their network segmentation to ensure these management interfaces aren't exposed unnecessarily. CV-2000 and 26-42208, added May 8th with a May 11th due date, affects Berry AI Lite LLM. This is a SQL injection vulnerability that allows an attacker to read data from the proxy's database and potentially modify it. Lite LLM is used as a proxy for various large language model APIs, so organizations using it for AI applications need to be concerned. SQL injection remains one of the most common and dangerous vulnerability classes because it can lead to complete database compromise. In this context, that could mean exposed API keys, usage data, or the ability to manipulate how the proxy routes requests. CV-2000 and 26-6973 affects Ivanti Endpoint Manager Mobile, added May 7th with a May 10th due date. This is an improper input validation vulnerability that allows a remotely authenticated user with administrative privileges to perform certain actions. While this requires some level of existing access, administrative access to endpoint management systems is exactly the kind of access attackers seek after initial compromise. These systems control device policies, application deployment, and configuration across mobile device fleets. Now, CV-2000 and 26-300 is the big one we need to talk about in detail. This was added May 6th with a May 9th due date. This affects Palo Alto Networks PAN-OS and involves an out-of-bounds write vulnerability in the User ID Authentication Portal, also known as Captive Portal Service. This vulnerability can allow remote code execution. Palo Alto's firewalls are incredibly widely deployed in enterprise environments, and a vulnerability that allows remote code execution on firewall infrastructure is catastrophic. An attacker who can execute code on your firewall has, by definition, a strategic position to monitor, modify, or disrupt all traffic flowing through your network. Palo Alto released patches, and there was significant coverage in the security community when this was disclosed. Organizations need to verify they're patched and review logs for any indicators of exploitation. CV-2000 and 26-31431, added May 1st with a May 15th due date, affects the Linux kernel. This is described as an incorrect resource transfer between spheres vulnerability that could allow for privilege escalation. This is what's being called copy-fail in the security community, and Palo Alto Unit 42 describes it as the most severe Linux threat in years. The technical details involve how the kernel handles certain resource transfers, and successful exploitation allows a local attacker to escalate privileges to root. Given how ubiquitous Linux is in server infrastructure, cloud environments, IoT devices, and embedded systems, this represents massive attack surface. The due date has already passed, so patching is overdue for many organizations. Let's turn to what Bleeping Computer is reporting. They have a story about Grafana saying a stolen GitHub token let hackers steal their codebase. Grafana is widely used for observability and monitoring. What happened here is that attackers compromised a GitHub token that had access to Grafana's repositories and were able to exfiltrate source code. This is concerning on multiple levels. First, source code theft can reveal vulnerabilities that attackers can then exploit in deployed instances. Second, it raises questions about how the token was compromised in the first place and what other access it might have provided. Third, for a company in the observability space, this is particularly ironic. You're supposed to be watching everything, and yet your own repositories were compromised. This underscores the ongoing challenges with secrets management, token rotation, and least privilege access, even at companies that should know better. Bleeping Computer also reports that Microsoft is testing an adjustable taskbar and start menu in Windows 11. Now, this isn't a security story per se, but it's worth mentioning because interface design decisions have security implications. Users who are frustrated by interface limitations often resort to third-party tools or registry hacks, which can introduce security risks. Microsoft adding official flexibility is positive from that perspective. More concerning from Bleeping Computer is their report that Microsoft has confirmed Windows 11 security update install issues. They're referring to KB5,089,549, which is having problems installing on some systems. This is a perennial challenge in the Windows ecosystem, security updates that either fail to install or cause system issues. When updates don't install reliably, it leaves systems vulnerable. When updates cause problems, it makes administrators hesitant to deploy them promptly. This is one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't situations that the security community has been dealing with for decades. Bleeping Computer has a story about exploit code being available for a new dirty decrypt Linux root escalation flaw. Anytime you have publicly available exploit code for a privilege escalation vulnerability, that's a critical concern because it lowers the bar for exploitation. Attackers who gain initial access to a Linux system through some other means now have a readily available tool to escalate to root privileges. This is often how attack chains work: initial compromise via phishing or exposed service, then privilege escalation via something like dirty decrypt, then persistence and lateral movement. They're also reporting on Pwn2Own Berlin 2026, where hackers earned over $1.2 million for 47 zero days. Pwn2Own competitions are fascinating because they provide a legitimate market for vulnerability research. Researchers demonstrate previously unknown vulnerabilities in widely used software and hardware, get paid substantial bounties, and vendors get advance notice to patch before the vulnerabilities become public. This year's Berlin event clearly had significant findings across multiple product categories. The fact that 47 zero days were demonstrated tells you that even mature, widely deployed software continues to have serious security issues. Bleeping Computer reports on a new Windows 0 day called MiniPlasma that gives system access, with proof-of-concept code released. System access on Windows is equivalent to root on Unix systems. It's the highest privilege level. Any vulnerability that allows escalation to system is critical, and when proof-of-concept code is publicly available, exploitation in the wild typically follows quickly. Organizations need to watch for Microsoft's response and patch immediately when available. Another story from Bleeping Computer covers Tycoon2FA hijacking Microsoft 365 accounts via device code phishing. This is an interesting attack because it leverages the device code flow, which is designed to allow authentication on devices without traditional input methods. Think smart TVS or IoT devices. Attackers are tricking users into approving device code authentication requests, which then gives the attackers access to the victim's Microsoft 365 account. This is a good example of how legitimate authentication mechanisms can be abused, and it highlights the importance of user education alongside technical controls. Finally, from Bleeping Computer, there's a report that Microsoft rejected a critical Azure vulnerability report and no CVE was issued. This is troubling because it suggests a disconnect between security researchers and vendor vulnerability assessment. When researchers find what they believe is a critical vulnerability and the vendor disagrees, it creates several problems. The researcher may go public out of frustration. Users don't know if they're vulnerable, and there's no CVE identifier to track the issue. This particular case involves Azure, which is foundational infrastructure for many organizations, so the stakes are high. Krebs on Security has his Patch Tuesday for May 2026 edition, which provides his usual comprehensive overview of Microsoft's monthly security updates. Brian Krebs consistently provides valuable context on which patches are most critical and which vulnerabilities are being actively exploited. His Patch Tuesday posts are essential reading for security teams. Krebs also reports on a Canvas breach, disrupting schools and colleges nationwide. Canvas is a learning management system used extensively in education. When these systems are compromised, it affects not just availability of educational services, but also student privacy, grading systems, and institutional operations. The education sector has increasingly become a target for cybercriminals, partly because schools and universities often have limited security resources compared to the sensitivity of data they hold. He's also covering an anti-DDoS firm that allegedly heaped attacks on Brazilian ISPs. This is darkly ironic. A company that's supposed to protect against distributed denial of service attacks was apparently launching them. This kind of story raises important questions about accountability in the security services industry and conflicts of interest. Schneier on Security has a piece on a zero-day exploit against Windows BitLocker, which connects to the story we mentioned earlier from Lobsters. Bruce Schneier's analysis typically provides important context on the broader implications of security vulnerabilities, and his take on the BitLocker situation will be worth reading carefully. Let's dive into threat intelligence from Palo Alto Networks Unit 42. They've published several significant pieces of research that we need to discuss. First is their research on Gremlin Stealer's evolved tactics, specifically how it's hiding in plain sight with resource files. Gremlin Stealer is an information-stealing malware that targets credentials, browser data, cryptocurrency wallets, and other sensitive information. What Unit 42 is documenting is the evolution of this malware family's techniques to avoid detection. By hiding malicious code in resource files, the malware makes static analysis more difficult and can bypass some security tools that focus primarily on executable code. This is part of a broader pattern we're seeing where malware authors continuously adapt their techniques in response to defensive measures. The resource file approach is clever because these files are often treated differently by security scanners. They're expected to contain data rather than code. Understanding these evolving tactics is important because defensive strategies need to adapt accordingly. Organizations should be reviewing their endpoint detection and response configurations to ensure they're monitoring resource file usage and looking for behavioral indicators rather than relying solely on signature-based detection. Unit 42's piece on Active Directory Certificate Services exploitation is particularly important for enterprise security teams. Active Directory Certificate Services, or ADCS, is used extensively in Windows environments to issue and manage digital certificates. These certificates are used for authentication, encryption, and establishing trust relationships. What Unit 42 is documenting is how attackers are abusing ADCS misconfigurations and design features to escalate privileges, achieve persistence, and move laterally. The research unpacks advanced misuse techniques and tools that attackers are using in real-world intrusions. This matters enormously because ADCS is deeply integrated into enterprise authentication infrastructure. If an attacker can abuse ADCS, they can potentially issue themselves valid certificates that allow persistent access that's difficult to detect and revoke. The research discusses specific attack techniques and tools, and organizations need to audit their ADCS deployments against the indicators and configurations that Unit 42 identifies. This is one of those areas where the complexity of the technology creates security gaps that attackers are actively exploiting. Unit 42 published a threat brief on the exploitation of the PAN-OS captive portal zero-day for unauthenticated remote code execution. This is CV-2026-300, which we covered in the CISA KEV section. Unit 42's analysis provides deeper technical details about how the vulnerability works, indicators of compromise to look for, and the threat landscape context. They're seeing exploitation in the wild, which means this isn't just a theoretical concern. The captive portal feature is often enabled in environments where guest wireless access is provided, which means there's significant attack surface. Unit 42's recommendations include not just patching, but also network segmentation to limit exposure and enhanced monitoring for suspicious activity targeting these interfaces. Their piece on copy fail, that's CV-2026-31431 in the Linux kernel, describes it as the most severe Linux threat in years. This assessment from Unit 42 carries weight because they analyze threat data from a huge number of enterprise environments through Palo Alto's security platforms. The vulnerability involves incorrect resource transfer between privilege boundaries in the kernel, and successful exploitation allows local privilege escalation to root. What makes this so severe is the combination of factors. It affects a huge installed base of Linux systems. Exploitation isn't particularly difficult once you understand the mechanism, and the impact is complete system compromise. Unit 42's analysis likely includes details about exploitation in the wild, which variants and configurations are most vulnerable, and detection strategies. Organizations need to be prioritizing patching of Linux systems and implementing additional monitoring for privilege escalation attempts. Finally, Unit 42 has an updated piece on the NPM threat landscape, covering attack surface and mitigations. The NPM ecosystem, that's the node package manager for JavaScript, represents a massive and complex supply chain that's under constant attack. Attackers are publishing malicious packages, typo-squatting legitimate package names, compromising maintainer accounts, and inserting malicious code into dependencies of popular packages. Unit 42's ongoing monitoring of this threat landscape provides crucial intelligence for organizations that rely on NPM packages in their development and deployment pipelines. The update from May 1st suggests they're tracking evolving attack techniques. Organizations need to be implementing package verification, dependency scanning, and supply chain security controls. The challenge with NPM is the sheer scale. There are millions of packages, and the dependency trees can be incredibly deep. A single application might transitively depend on hundreds of packages, any of which could be compromised. The broader threat landscape context that emerges from Unit 42's research is one of increasing sophistication and persistence. Attackers are investing significant resources into understanding complex enterprise technologies like ADCS, finding and exploiting zero days in widely deployed infrastructure like PanOS and Linux, and compromising software supply chains. The cat-and-mouse game between attackers and defenders continues to escalate, and organizations need to be continuously updating their defensive postures based on current threat intelligence. Unit 42's research is valuable because it's grounded in real-world observations from enterprise environments rather than being purely theoretical. They're seeing these attacks in their telemetry, which means these aren't hypothetical scenarios. They're active threats that need immediate attention. Let's turn to AI and machine learning research, starting with some fascinating papers from Archive. First up is a paper on IVGT, which stands for Implicit Visual Geometry Transformer for Neural Scene Representation. This is Archive 2605.16258. What the researchers are tackling is the fundamental problem of reconstructing coherent 3D geometry and appearance from multiple images that don't have known camera positions. This is incredibly challenging because you're essentially trying to figure out what the 3D scene looks like and where the cameras were at the same time. The traditional approach involves explicit geometric reconstruction, but this paper proposes using transformers, the same architecture that powers large language models, to learn implicit representations of scene geometry. What's interesting here is the application of transformer architectures, which have been so successful in natural language processing, to 3D vision problems. The implicit representation approach means the model learns a continuous function that maps from 3D coordinates to properties like occupancy or radiance, rather than building explicit mesh or voxel representations. This can lead to more efficient and higher quality reconstructions. The practical applications range from robotics and autonomous vehicles, which need to understand 3D environments from camera data, to content creation for games and VR, where you want to capture real-world spaces efficiently. There's a really important paper on designing data center power delivery hierarchies for the AI era. This is Archive 2605.16255. The researchers point out that demand for AI accelerators is rapidly increasing rack power density, with projections approaching 1 megawatt per deployment by 2027. Think about that for a moment, 1 megawatt per rack. Traditional data center power infrastructure isn't designed for this. The paper addresses the major challenges this creates for power delivery architecture. They're looking at everything from building-level power distribution to rack-level delivery, considering efficiency, redundancy, cooling integration, and cost. This might not sound as exciting as the latest AI model, but it's absolutely critical infrastructure work. We're at a point where the power and cooling requirements of AI infrastructure are becoming fundamental limiters on what's possible. If we can't solve the power delivery problem, we can't deploy the compute we need. The paper likely discusses various architectural approaches, trade-offs between centralized and distributed power conversion, and how to handle the dynamic load characteristics of AI workloads. This is the kind of unglamorous but essential engineering that makes the AI revolution possible. Another paper addresses a generative AI framework for intelligent utility, billing COO analytics, and sustainable resource optimization. This is arXiv 2605.1625. The researchers are focused on helping distribution utilities deliver bills that are actually readable and understandable by customers, and attach a defensible carbon number to every kilowatt-hour sold. This is fascinating because it's applying AI to a very practical problem with significant implications for climate action. Right now, most electricity bills are opaque. You get a number, you pay it, but you don't really understand your consumption patterns or their environmental impact. By using generative AI to create better analytics and visualization, and by calculating the carbon footprint of electricity consumption in real time based on grid mix, utilities can empower consumers to make better decisions. The sustainable resource optimization component likely involves using AI to recommend changes in consumption patterns or timing that would reduce carbon emissions. This is an example of AI being applied not to make another chatbot or image generator, but to help solve real-world sustainability challenges. There's a concerning paper on how AI-mediated communication can steer collective opinion. This is arXiv 2605.16245. The researchers examine how large language models are increasingly integrated into online platforms where humans exchange opinions, and they're finding that these AI systems can systematically influence collective opinion formation. This is really important work because we're in a transitional period where more and more of our communication is being filtered, summarized, or mediated by AI systems. The paper likely demonstrates that subtle biases or steering in AI-mediated communication can shift group consensus in predictable directions. This has implications for everything from social media to collaborative decision-making platforms to online deliberation tools. The concerning part is that this influence could be nearly invisible to participants. They think they're having organic discussions, but the AI mediation is subtly shaping outcomes. We need to be thinking carefully about how we deploy AI in communication contexts and what safeguards are necessary to preserve genuine human discourse. Another paper addresses offline semantic guidance for efficient vision-language action policy distillation. This is arXiv 2605.16241. The context here is that billion-parameter vision-language action models, or VLAs, have shown impressive performance in robotic manipulation, but their size makes them impractical for deployment on actual robots. This paper is about distillation, taking a large, capable model and creating a smaller, more efficient model that retains much of the capability. The offline semantic guidance approach likely involves using the large model to generate training data or guidance for the smaller model without requiring online interaction during distillation. This is important practical work because while we can demonstrate impressive robotic capabilities with massive models running on GPU clusters, the real deployment of robotics requires models that can run on edge hardware, respond in real time, and operate within power and compute budgets. Effective distillation techniques are key to bridging this gap between research demonstrations and practical deployment. Finally, there's a paper on dynamics-level watermarking of flow matching models with random codes. This is arXiv 2605.16239. Watermarking of generative models is becoming increasingly important as these models become more powerful and widely deployed. The goal is to be able to identify whether content was generated by a specific model, which has implications for attribution, detecting deepfakes, and enforcing usage terms. What's novel here is the dynamics-level approach. Rather than embedding watermarks in the model weights or in the output, they're embedding the watermark in the generative process itself, specifically in flow matching models. The random codes aspect likely means each instance of the model can have a unique identifier. This is part of the broader effort to create accountability and traceability in generative AI systems. As these models become more capable of creating realistic synthetic content, we need robust ways to identify that content's provenance. Looking at the broader AI industry landscape beyond these specific papers, we're seeing continued tension between the rapid pace of capability development and the infrastructure, safety, and governance challenges. The data center power paper highlights physical infrastructure constraints. The utility billing paper shows practical applications of AI to sustainability. The collective opinion paper raises concerns about AI's influence on human discourse. And the watermarking paper addresses accountability challenges. These aren't separate issues, they're all part of the complex reality of deploying increasingly powerful AI systems in the real world. We're also seeing, in stories from our earlier segments, how AI is creating new problems even as it creates new capabilities. The Linux security mailing list being overwhelmed by AI-generated bug reports, bug bounty programs being flooded with AI-generated submissions. These are examples of how automation at scale can break existing processes. The answer isn't necessarily to stop using AI, but we need to be thoughtful about how we integrate it into existing systems and what new mechanisms we need to manage its effects. Welcome back to the second half of today's Clovis brief. Let's talk about what's happening in the home lab and infrastructure world. Over on GitHub Trending, there's been some interesting activity in the self-hosting and infrastructure space. One project catching my eye is Llama CPP, which continues to see strong community engagement for running large language models locally. This ties into the broader trend we're seeing where more people want to run AI workloads on their own hardware rather than relying on cloud services. For those of you running Proxmox or Unraid systems with beefy GPUs, this is becoming increasingly practical. Speaking of containerization, there's been steady development in the Kubernetes ecosystem. While I don't have specific releases to announce today, the trend toward lighter-weight alternatives continues. K3s and similar projects are making it more practical to run production-grade orchestration on home lab hardware. If you're still running everything in Docker Compose, now might be a good time to explore what Kubernetes can offer, especially with tools like K3s that strip away the complexity of full production deployments. For networking enthusiasts, the conversation around eBPF continues to grow. This technology is fundamentally changing how we think about network observability and security at the kernel level. If you're running OP-NSense or similar firewall solutions, keep an eye on how eBPF-based tools might enhance your monitoring capabilities. The ability to inspect and filter packets at unprecedented speeds without leaving kernel space is genuinely transformative. Home Assistant users should be aware that the community continues to push boundaries with local AI integration. The ability to run voice assistants, image recognition, and automation logic entirely within your home network is becoming more practical. With the Llama CPP developments I mentioned earlier, you can now run surprisingly capable language models on modest hardware. I've been experimenting with local voice processing, and while it's not quite as polished as cloud services, the privacy benefits are significant. On the Unraid front, the community is seeing interesting developments around ZFS support and more sophisticated caching strategies. If you're planning storage expansions, it's worth looking at the latest discussions around mixed SSD and HDD configurations. The ability to use NVMe drives as cache while maintaining spinning Rust for bulk storage continues to offer the best price-to-performance ratio for media servers and backup solutions. For those running Proxmox, virtualization of networking equipment remains a hot topic. Running virtual OP-NSense instances alongside your other VMS can simplify management, but you need to be thoughtful about your physical NIC setup. Pass-through versus virtual networking is one of those decisions that depends heavily on your specific use case and performance requirements. Docker security remains crucial. Over on Lobsters, there was discussion about container image supply chain issues. It's worth auditing what you're pulling from Docker Hub. Consider using tools like Trivy to scan your images for vulnerabilities before deployment. The convenience of pulling random containers is tempting, but each one is potentially introducing security issues into your environment. Moving into science and space news, let me tell you what's happening beyond our atmosphere. NASA has announced that science cargo launched on the 34th SpaceX resupply mission to the International Space Station. This continues the remarkable partnership between NASA and commercial space companies. These regular resupply missions carry experiments that simply cannot be conducted on Earth. The microgravity environment allows researchers to study materials science, biology, and physics in ways that ground-based labs cannot replicate. The Curiosity rover on Mars has been dealing with a pesky rock situation. NASA reports that Curiosity successfully shook loose a rock that had been interfering with its operations. This might sound mundane, but remember, we're troubleshooting mechanical issues on a robot that's hundreds of millions of miles away. The fact that mission controllers can diagnose and resolve these problems remotely speaks to the sophisticated engineering behind these missions. The Hubble Space Telescope continues to deliver stunning science, with recent observations of a galaxy in transition. NASA reports this galaxy is providing insights into how galaxies evolve over cosmic time. Even after more than 3 decades in orbit, Hubble remains a workhorse of astronomical research. The James Webb Space Telescope gets a lot of attention, but Hubble's longer wavelength observations provide complementary data that's still irreplaceable. NASA is drawing on industry expertise for developing a Mars telecommunications network. This is forward-thinking infrastructure work that will be critical for future Mars missions. As we move toward more ambitious exploration, including potential human missions, we need robust communication systems. The current relay satellites have done remarkable work, but the next generation needs to support higher data rates and more simultaneous connections. Ars Technica reports that registrations at Space Camp have doubled following the Artemis II mission. This is exactly the kind of cultural impact we hope these missions will have. Inspiring the next generation of engineers, scientists, and astronauts is as important as the technical achievements themselves. Space Camp has been introducing kids to space exploration for decades, and seeing renewed interest is encouraging for the future of the space program. There's also been discussion about whether Starship will finally deliver for the broader US space enterprise. Eric Berger over at Ars Technica digs into the expectations and realities. The space industry is increasingly dependent on SpaceX's heavy lift capabilities, and while Starship has made progress, it still hasn't reached operational status. The timeline keeps slipping, and that's creating pressure across multiple programs that were counting on its capabilities. From an astronomical perspective, we're in an interesting time of year for stargazing. As we move deeper into spring in the Northern Hemisphere, the summer triangle of Vega, Altair, and Deneb is becoming more prominent in the evening sky. If you're in a dark enough area, now is a great time to observe the Milky Way's summer core. Get away from city lights if you can, the view is worth it. Let's turn to business, economy, and what's happening closer to home. The International Monetary Fund has upgraded its UK growth forecast, though risks remain. This ties into broader concerns about global economic stability. For those of us in tech, these macroeconomic trends matter because they influence investment, hiring, and project funding. We've seen how quickly the venture capital environment can shift when economic uncertainty rises. The tech industry continues to navigate complex waters. Anthropic's $1.5 billion copyright settlement is getting messy, with a judge delaying approval. Ars Technica reports that authors are fighting for higher payouts from the settlement. This is one of many legal battles trying to determine how AI companies can use copyrighted material for training. The outcomes will shape the entire AI industry's approach to data acquisition. On the local front here in McHenry County, we're seeing typical spring weather patterns. Today's high of about 82 degrees with light drizzle is pretty standard for mid-May in Illinois. But look at that forecast for the rest of the week. We're dropping from the 80s on Monday down to the low 50s by Friday. That's a 30-degree swing, folks. If you're planning outdoor activities in the Wonder Lake or Woodstock area this week, you'll want to layer up by the weekend. For the local tech community, this is a good time to remind folks about networking opportunities in the area. The Chicago tech scene has regular meetups that are worth the drive, and there are growing communities in the suburbs for everything from cybersecurity to cloud architecture. If you're looking to connect with other technologists in the region, those gatherings can be valuable for career development and learning. The housing market in McHenry County remains active, though we're seeing some of the frenzy from previous years cool down. Interest rates continue to play a major role in affordability. For those of you considering home office setups or dedicated home lab spaces, the market conditions might be worth monitoring if you're thinking about moving or upgrading. And that brings us to the end of today's Clovis Brief. We've covered a lot of ground today, from critical Windows vulnerabilities to the ongoing AI slop problem in bug bounties, from Linux security list challenges to exciting developments in home lab technology and space exploration. Tomorrow we'll be diving into some fascinating developments in the maker and hardware hacking space, plus I'll have more updates on the evolving AI regulatory landscape. There's some interesting movement happening at the state level that's worth understanding, especially if you're building or deploying AI systems. Thank you for spending part of your Monday with me. If you found this useful, share it with a colleague who might appreciate a daily tech and security briefing. I'm here every weekday morning with the news and analysis you need to stay informed. Stay secure, stay curious, and I'll talk to you tomorrow on the Clovis Brief.